much to Fortune Fish. It's delicious. Thank you very much. So today we have a great panel. We're focusing on Midwest aquaculture. I would like to give a quick shout out to Aislinn Gaucher, who's tucked over there in the back corner, for thinking of this as a topic that we should discuss and pulling together this incredible panel of experts. So today we are going to be talking about Midwest aquaculture. When I'm out and about in the restaurant community and in the foodie community in Chicago, people are often surprised to hear that there's aquaculture in the Midwest. So we're going to discuss this a little bit today. There's huge opportunity in the Midwest for aquaculture given the interest in local seafood. Folks in this area love to eat local, so this is a source for local seafood. And also, with thanks to John for giving me some industry intel, the Chicago area, the Midwest, tends to prefer freshwater fish as well for seafood. So again, with that interest in local and then a preference for freshwater fish, you have this really interesting opportunity for a really thriving aquaculture industry in this area. So just very quickly, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have John Connelly, who I just mentioned, who's the president of the National Fisheries Institute, which is the leading organization in North America that advocates for the seafood supply chain. So we have a true industry expert here to speak about aquaculture, so thank you very much, John, for coming. We also have Dr. Jim Diana here from University of Michigan. And Dr. Diana is considered one of the experts in aquaculture. It's one of his focuses of research. He is on the Monterey Bay Seafood Watch Advisory Board for the research that they do around fisheries and aquaculture. And he's also recently, in 2010, received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the World Aquaculture Society. So again, we have this incredible source of knowledge right here on our panel. Thank you for joining us, Jim. Dr. Steven Hart is here. He's the executive director of the Soy Aquaculture Alliance, which is working to support and develop the domestic aquaculture industry. And Dr. Hart's interest in research is aquaculture and nutrition and the opportunities for soy-based feeds over fish meal-based feeds. We also have Norm McCowan here from Bell. If you are at all in tune with Midwest aquaculture, you likely know of Bell Farms and all the incredible products that are coming out of there, out of Indiana. Not only are there fish species coming out of Bell Aquaculture, but they're also doing really cutting-edge research on different kinds of feed and also using organic fertilizer as other products. And then finally, we have Dr. Michael Rubino from NOAA. He is I keep on forgetting we have nice PowerPoint. Dr. Rubino is the director of the NOAA Office of Aquaculture. So NOAA out of DC regulates fisheries and aquaculture for the US, and we have Dr. Rubino here who oversees all the aquaculture work. So with that, the way we're going to run this session is a very casual Q&A. I really encourage all of you to ask questions. We're going to make sure to have time towards the end for that. So let's just get started. As I mentioned in my intro, a lot of people are surprised to hear that there is an aquaculture industry in the Midwest. And not only is there one, but it's growing rapidly and it's thriving. So Norman, if we could start with you, I'm hoping that you could speak to the growth of the aquaculture industry in the Midwest and the kind of products that we're seeing coming out of the farms.
Yeah, so when you look at the Midwest, we see several different species being raised: shrimp, trout, Arctic char. Some of these products are here available even at the most within the show. But for example, in Indiana right now, we have somewhere between 50 and 55 aquaculture farms running. And we see it continue to grow, maybe in a little diverse way by doing what they call aquaponics. We see a lot of investment in that right now in the Midwest, where they're growing actual fish and also plants with that. And with that, we're starting to see some offshoots of that, value-added companies. And for example, we've started a feed company. We also do fertilizer. So we're seeing some value-added products come off of offshoots of that industry as well in the Midwest. And it's something that's much needed, because when you look at the 9 to 10 billion people we're going to have to feed by 2020, we got a coming protein deficit. and we need to address that deficit. And if we're going to have seafood available, we've got to raise it ourselves.
Thank you. But to this point of the protein deficit and the role that aquaculture might, is this on? Y'all can hear me? Okay. To the point of this protein deficit that we're seeing ahead and the role that aquaculture can play in addressing that, Jim, I know that part of your research interest is, can y'all hear me? Okay. One of your research interests is the role of aquaculture in being able to feed the ever-growing population. So I'm hoping that you could speak a bit to aquaculture and fish as a protein in terms of environmental impacts as compared to other protein production like beef and pork and so on.
Did that work? Oh, there it was. I'd be glad to. I have looked at aquaculture worldwide for An interesting point is that seafood is an important driver of economy. This one works? All right, so seafood is, in terms of an export, has more value than the combined crops of coffee, tea, bananas, rice, and meat. So it's a major generator of income, and the developing countries of the world have taken advantage of that. Many of them have really promoted aquaculture to try to meet that export market to sell to places like the United States. And unfortunately, that's made us have a fairly major seafood deficit in the United States as a result. I think that aquaculture in the United States, we kind of suffered a little bit because we haven't had the kind of investment that we see in agriculture in general. You know, we talk about billions of dollars for the land grants university system, for veterinarians, feed development, subsidies to farmers. None of that exists in aquaculture, so it makes aquaculture much less competitive from that point of view. If we want to look at environmental impacts, more recently we've done something we call life cycle assessment. And what that tries to do is look at something and how its impact has been right from the start of making products that are used to build a farm, to making the products of a feed, to growing shrimp or fish, to disposing of the waste, and looking at different impact categories. Those categories, there's 9 of them, but some of them would be things like discharge of materials that result in eutrophication, production of global warming gases, electrical energy use, and a variety of things like that. So it's hard to completely compare products of different foods because in almost all cases, some are better in some characteristics, some are better in others. But let me just give you a couple examples. 1 ton of shrimp produces 5 times less global warming gases than 1 ton of beef. About the same as 1 ton of chicken or of pork. 1 ton of salmon produces less than all of those crops combined. In terms of eutrophication, of damages to water, shrimp is less than all 3 of those other meat products in terms of its eutrophication effect. We worry a lot about the effluents from shrimp farms, but in fact the effluents from shrimp farms are less damaging to the environment than production of beef, chickens, or pork. And then when you get to energy use, on the other hand, aquaculture moves up a bit. It tends to be somewhat higher, or at least comparable to all those other crops. So in terms of an environmental impact, in general, I would say aquaculture products have less of an environmental influence and less of a footprint than other meat production systems, or at least comparable to what we see with chickens. If we look at the farm itself, we find that farming the crop is what produces most of the impact. It's not building the farm, it's not disposing the waste, it's really doing the farming. And in fact, out of the farming, the big majority of that potential impact comes from feed. And that's not just true of aquaculture, that's true of most meat production as well. If you think of the kinds of aquaculture systems we have worldwide, we have ponds, we have raceway or flow-through systems, we have cages, we have these line systems we use for oysters and the like, and we have recirculating aquaculture. All of those except for the lines for oysters and ponds require feeding. You can have natural foods produced in ponds and in oyster culture, but beyond that, feeding is important. And so it's important that the feed use and the feed type is looked at carefully when we do aquaculture.
Thank you so much. To this point of feed, I know, Steve, this is a personal interest of yours. You did your PhD studying aquaculture nutrition, and it's a lot of work that you're doing right now with the Soy Aquaculture Alliance. So could you speak a bit more to what we're seeing right now in the Midwestern aquaculture industry in terms of feed, what's being used, what's not being used, et cetera?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And first thing I'd like to address is aquaculture tends to get a bad rap. You often hear, well, it takes more fish in feed to grow a pound of fish. You often hear 5 pounds of fish to grow 1 pound of aquaculture fish. And those numbers are really, really outdated by over a decade. The latest numbers are, for an industry average, we're at about 0.3 pounds of fish to grow 1 pound of aquaculture fish. And even when you go to the most carnivorous fish, and the one that's gotten the biggest black eye for this is Atlantic salmon. The Atlantic salmon industry is now at about 1.4 pounds of fish to grow a pound. So they're still working on getting under that 1-to-1, but it's a vast improvement where the industry was just a decade ago. The reason for this is the development of alternative feed ingredients. Historically, when the aquaculture industry was first getting started and was not a huge volume industry, fish meal and fish oil were the primary feed ingredients used in feeds. And at that time, that's great. That's what was available. It worked very well. And if you think about the animal's natural diet, it made sense because you're feeding them something similar to what they would eat in the wild. But as the industry grew and that fish meal industry was getting more and more pressure and more demand, we saw prices for fish meal skyrocket. And once those prices started to go up, the economics of aquaculture started to look not quite so good. So feed companies started looking for alternatives. And now you've got a whole buffet of selections. If you're a feed mill, there's all different kinds of protein sources now that you can choose. By far, the #1 protein source used in fish feeds today is soybean meal. 10 million metric tons, more than 10 million metric tons of soy are currently being used in aquaculture feeds globally. When you look at fish meal, the estimate is about 4 million metric tons of fish meal are being used globally. So we're at least 2.5 times the amount of soy meal used over fish meal. So that's really, when you look at growing an aquaculture industry in the Midwest and what would you feed these fish, well, the Midwest is called the Corn Belt. We grow a lot of corn and soybeans, a lot of wheat here in the Midwest, and those are all staples of feeds. And they go into a lot of livestock feeds that we're using, as well as they go into fish feeds. In reality, when you look at what goes into a feed mill, it's pretty much, an aquaculture feed mill is pretty much the same ingredients that you would be using for any other feed mill. The technology to produce those feeds is a little bit different because you're feeding an animal that is swimming in water, and you need that pellet to be stable in the water, so the technology is a little bit different, but the actual ingredients to go in the feed are not all that different than what you would see in any other feed mill.
So what I've been hearing so far is that we have this industry, Midwest aquaculture. It's growing, it's thriving. There's a lot of cutting edge research going on. It's helping to address a protein deficit. It's also helping to feed a regional palate that prefers these kinds of foods, and also like their foods have a local story behind them. That there's a lot of progress in controlling waste resource inputs in the feed. And a lot of that feed, I assume, is fairly local as well. So that's the current state of Midwest aquaculture right now. That's kind of where we are right now. So, Michael, you have quite a career that spans academia, business, research, and now with NOAA, oversight of aquaculture. So I'm curious from your perspective, where do you see Midwest aquaculture going in the future?
Thanks, sir. It's working out. Can everybody hear me? Yes? No? Okay. Before I answer the question, just two things. First, I wanted to thank the Aquarium and Fortune Fish for hosting this session and this conference. It's been a great day so far. Just walking around the hall, there's some incredible examples of innovators and producers of U.S. aquaculture here today. If you look at, I just wrote some of them down, Clear Springs in Idaho, one of the founders of sort of the trout industry. Cherry Stone of clams and now oysters. Australis, one of the first companies to do recirculating aquaculture. And there are many others now, like Rushing Waters for trout. There are two Chesapeake Bay oyster farms, Rappahannock and Hollywood are here, one from Long Island, the ones with the guys who are walking around in his underpants. As well as Bell Aquaculture here on our panel. So we've got, and then there are other people in the audience that I've met here who are doing aquaculture in the Midwest as well. So you've got here at your own show sort of the potential for aquaculture in the Midwest represented. When I try to think about an answer to this question, the Midwest is in the middle. We're also in the middle of the whole value chain of seafood and aquaculture, from sort of the equipment, the feed, the research and development end. You've got fabulous universities in this region, all the way through to producers, to end consumers. This is a giant consumer market in the Midwest. So one of the things we're doing as a federal agency, not just NOAA, but also working with USDA and universities and the private sector, is to work on sort of the innovation in aquaculture, which I think will help all of the Midwestern producers. Innovation in terms of sort of genetics, the mamas and the papas, in terms of making a better fish or a better shrimp or a better oyster, through feeds and nutrition, getting more efficient feeds, to the design of different kinds of production systems, smart design, more efficient designs, cheaper designs in terms of production. All of that, I think, will help catapult this nascent industry, which is vibrant but still small, into something much bigger in the next couple of years.
So, along those lines, you mentioned it, small but emerging Midwest aquaculture industry, and John, you represent the seafood industry in many ways. You are a global seafood industry expert. Curious where you see the Midwest aquaculture industry in the context of the global seafood industry.
Sure. On the to look at it from imports and exports, some of you may know that we import about 85% of the seafood that we enjoy in the U.S. Some people say that's a disappointment. On the other hand, if you look at what Fortune does, Fortune's a great example of a company that provides fantastic domestic Midwestern agriculture, but also imported foods, because that's what we enjoy. So it's something we need to be careful about. I'm not saying it's a total disappointment. That said, it's also important on the import side to recognize that Norman or Rushing Waters or Clear Springs compete in a global market. So when Sean and his team and Fortune try to present things to the chefs, or the chefs in turn present it to my wife and I when we go out, it has to be competitive, or if it's not priced in the same area, the story has to be told. And that's where I think folks like Norman or others in the Midwest have a great opportunity. Rushing Waters, a very interesting story to tell in this local market, because your food miles are obviously, the legs of that are 50 miles from the pond. And you have a very good, as the doctor from Michigan said, very good sustainability story. So you can tell that story even if the price is a little bit different than an imported tilapia or something like that. I think that's where your supply chain does a very good job. Your partners all along the supply chain, all the way down to the chefs here in the group. On the flip side, the exports, the U.S. is increasingly exporting product. I have a son that just graduated from college. Next week he's moving to China for 2 years to work for a seafood company because they wanted to have a Westerner in their operation to be able to convey the sense of prestige and food safety. Particularly in China, the issues of food safety continue to be challenges, and the perception of Western food is we are much safer, and people want it. So all the melamine issues, all of the nursing, formula scares for young moms in China, that actually created markets for U.S. foods to be exported. Things like the scallop industry, one of the reasons scallops are so expensive is because more and more scallops are actually being shipped to China, or in turn, they're actually not being shipped from China to here. And so I think the story could also include some export opportunities. There are some regulatory hurdles that Norm was explaining to me earlier, but I think that's where we need to work with government in order to, if we have this local market, feed both ourselves, but also look for opportunities overseas. And I think the government needs to be part of that solution in helping to break down some of those barriers.
So at this point, I have a few things to say, because anybody who knows me knows I always have things to say. But I would also welcome questions from all of you. We wanted to make sure that we had plenty of time to answer your questions. I do want to take a moment to address the elephant in the room, however, and that is that people are always a little taken aback that Shed Aquarium is talking about seafood. I'm seeing some nods, so I'll just address that. So Shed does have a significant sustainable seafood program that we call Right Bite. And the reason being is that what we eat, what's on our plates in terms of seafood, is our direct connection, every single one of us, it's our direct connection to the water, oceans, lakes, river, what have you. So at Shed, we really want to see a thriving community in Chicago, the Chicago region, around sustainable seafood. So we would love to see on every plate in the Midwest there to be a fantastic sustainable seafood option. So we work quite a bit with the industry here in Chicago, the culinary industry, to encourage to bring these options more into our market, to see them on menus, to see them in grocery stores and so on. And what that translates to is me and my team get to eat a lot of delicious seafood, which is wonderful. I do want to just take a moment to recognize Fortune Fish for the work that they do in this realm, because I feel like a lot of the work that they do is unseen or unknown. And especially, I saw Stacy back there. So there she is, Stacy Schultz from Fortune, who feels like she's part of Shed's sustainable seafood team. I mean, she's tireless in the work that she does. She teaches us quite a bit about what's in the market. She works with us quite a bit. She helps us help chefs make changes to their menus and so on. So we consider Fortune Fish a very close friend and partner in our work around sustainable seafood. So thank you to Fortune, not only for that work and improving what we're seeing in the city and also supporting us, but also having events like this where Fortune tells us, what do you want people to know? Create your panel around that, and then we're able to bring these folks in front of all of you. So with that, what questions do we have for this panel? Any questions? Yes?
I actually wanted to go back because I know you started to touch upon where you see the future of sustainable seafood going in the Midwest. And I was wondering if you can go back to that question a little bit. I know that you're saying there's a lot in terms of innovation, but outside of that innovation, is there any particular trend that you're seeing, whether it's on restaurant menus or in supermarkets? What do you foresee happening in the near future in the Midwest? Work for anybody.
So, what does sustainability mean? A couple of panelists addressed this question of sustainability. Usually it goes back to sort of that triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Those three legs to the stool. You know, it's got to be able to make money from a financial perspective. We want to make sure from a social perspective that employees are happy and people are getting good, nutritious food. And then from an environmental perspective, that your footprint is as efficient or as small as possible. So one of the things we've done in the research community is particularly on the environmental side of sustainability. You heard a little bit about life cycle costing and analysis. But if you take, for example, one of the companies I didn't mention was Icicle, who are also here. They're one of the largest producers of farm salmon in the country. The other large producer is Cook Aquaculture in Maine. They now grow salmon using all local genetic stock, genetic marking. They have very efficient feeds. They have underwater cameras, so there's no excess feed that falls down. They fallow between crops, which means they take the cages away and let the benthic, the bottom environment, recover. They have a coordinated program of all the farms in Maine and on the Canadian side of the border for that. They employ people in one of the poorest counties in the country. And so, like, what more do you want in terms of sustainability? We're seeing the same kind of thing happen here, say with Bell Aquaculture or others, in recirculating systems. One of the big questions for recirculating aquaculture is, yeah, maybe you're not in the marine environment in terms of potential interactions with the marine environment, but you've got very high costs of production because you've got tanks and equipment and energy costs and so on. So from a financial sustainability perspective, what can we do to bring down those costs? Whether it be on the feed efficiencies, working with the feed industry and the soybean industry, or in terms of equipment, or in terms of water quality and water processing. So all of these areas of sustainability are worked on in that way.
Just maybe a couple of other points. As far as what's occurring at the retail and restaurant level, and there's a certain level of expectation that sustainability is no longer something special. It's just an expected part of your business, and no one sells food safety. You don't get a brand that says we haven't had a death in 15 years or we haven't had a recall in 20 years, because we all go to the store and expect our food to be safe. And I think more and more in the seafood world, whether wild or aquaculture, there's an expectation that things be done well. That's converting itself into consumer attitudes also. So there's less and less consumers that are asking for this in a way because they want Fortune and Norman and others to have done this work for them. So consumers expect the supply chain to have done this work, particularly in this show where there's a lot of work being done in the restaurant world. If you think about when you go out to dinner, you're not looking to save the world. You're looking, we have 4 kids. I'm looking to escape 4 children. And my wife and I are looking to avoid doing the dishes. So it's an escape. And when we ask people, there's a certain subset that's always going to want to do something, but most people expect the supply chain to do this work for them. And that's a good thing, because that means that the whole supply chain has an expectation.
Question about
Wait for the microphone.
Oh, hi. We're in the Midwest. We're surrounded by these Great Lakes, and in the U.S. we do not farm raise any fish in the Great Lakes. Our neighbors to the north do. Would somebody like to talk about that?
So recently, Michigan Sea Grant funded a project for the State Aquaculture Association of Michigan to talk about what they see the future of production being, and cage culture was a big part of that. It's also been a very controversial part of that. I think that right now, most cage culture operations are done much more effectively than they were in the past, but freshwater cage culture has been an extremely damaging thing over the years if you look at the history of cage culture. And we don't have very good models yet on how it'll work in the Great Lakes. One of the criticisms is something like, well, there's no tides, so it's not going to wash away the waste. I'm not sure that's really relevant, but we don't have the data to prove it isn't relevant. So I think there's a lot of information we still need to expand that. Where can we do aquaculture given recreational use, given shipping? given ice during the winter, where are we going to get the temperatures and the depths that are appropriate for that? Those are all issues that I think are still out there. So I do think cage culture, I think in 10 years you will see cage culture in the Great Lakes, but I think it's going to take that long for the background information to make people feel safe about this not causing the kinds of damage that we don't want to see in those lakes.
So, Dr. James, you mentioned that aquaculture products have less environmental impact, but John mentioned that 85% of seafood is imported. Is that life cycle analysis, is that kind of included in that?
So it's always, what do you compare? The example I gave you was comparing shrimp cultured in China, which actually are pretty, we would say, are lower standards of quality for the environment than shrimp produced in the U.S., but that comparison was there. Salmon produced in, I think that was in Norway where they did that. So it's looking at unfortunately with a life cycle assessment, you look at a specific industry, you have to know all about it. So you go to a particular farm or maybe a series of farms and take measurements. But it is accounting for that, and it is accounting for transportation. So flying shrimp from China to the U.S. is included in that impact too.
Although there'd be very few people that fly shrimp from China.
Sorry. Transporting it. Excuse me, I always think flying for some reason.
Forgive me if this is a silly question. This is for Mr. Hart. You had spoke earlier about the different types of feeds that are different now from in the past. I know that some include using fish, and then some include using soy and wheat products. So I was just wondering, is it pretty universal in terms of the types of fish that you feed this to? Like, are there different formulas, different concentrations, and how do they impact people in terms of allergens?
Yeah, thank you for the question. As far as the formulas, it's really very much species specific. So if you're feeding a Atlantic salmon, that diet is going to look a lot different than a feed for a shrimp or a tilapia. Salmon, when we think of salmon, we think of the healthful benefits of eating salmon are the omega-3 fatty acids. So a typical salmon diet might have 30% fat, whereas when you're feeding a tilapia or a catfish or something like that, you're looking at less than 10% fat. So the feeds vary a lot based on species, and the ingredients that go into that vary a lot based on species. There's a lot of fish that are herbivores or omnivores, and those type of animals like tilapia and in other parts of the world we raise a lot of carp. Those can eat a lot of soy, because if you think about their natural diet, it's more of a plant-based type of diet. Whereas we start looking at Atlantic salmon or other, especially marine fish, they're more carnivorous fish, that's where we tend to see a little more fish meal used, as well as other protein sources like poultry byproduct meal, or from the soy side, they can't eat as much soybean meal, so we have another ingredient that's called soy protein concentrate, where we take that soybean meal and then do another process to it to remove some of the carbohydrates, and now you have a protein concentrate. So there's different ingredients that are out there for different animals and different life stages of those animals. As far as the allergy issue goes, I'm not aware of anything that has ever shown that there's transfer. If you think about if people have soy allergies, for one, you wouldn't be able to eat pork, you wouldn't be able to eat chicken, you wouldn't be able to eat beef, because that's the primary protein source used in a lot of animal feeds.
I think we have time for one last question.
What about raising lake perch and cod?
Lake perch and cod. You get perch. Cod, yes, you get perch.
So lake perch is something we have raised in the past. Our facility is an indoor facility in tanks. But some of the hurdles that we're facing with some of the freshwater fish and some of the freshwater species that we're so used to in the Midwest is, like Michael had talked about, is the genetics are not there. And I think there needs to be a large investment to be able to improve the genetic stock for some of these species like lake perch, yellow perch, walleye, whitefish, to be able to make it cost effective and part of that sustainability model. When you look at the USDA, they got 283 ARS hubs in North America. For terrestrial animals, they only have 8 for aquaculture species. And yeah, most of those are for catfish. And the one that we do have in the Midwest has been defunded under the Farm Bill. So I think we've got to see that. We need to invest dollars into aquaculture to develop some of this genetic stock and some of these species that we need. And that's something that we're working on with many other industry leaders to help to develop that. Is it financially viable? Would I say it's financially viable to raise yellow perch at this point? Not without some further development of a genetic broodstock.
If I could just say one other thing. The history of aquaculture originally had this idea that if there's really a well-caught commercial fish, you can't compete with that in aquaculture. And if you look at the main production systems, usually you find either wild fisheries or aquaculture produce those crops. But more recently, we've been able to produce crops competitively with wild-caught fish all over the place. So that has dramatically changed in the last 10 years.
It's actually a great point, Doctor, that it's always important to remember that it is a business at the end of the day. Norman has people that he has to pay. So specific to cod, though, their Norwegians are considered to be the great technologists in this area, and they have not cracked the cod problem. It's a difficult issue. And wild cod stocks are actually in a significant rebound. Maybe not in the Gulf of Maine, but in other parts of the world, very significantly, cod stocks are up. And that then takes some of the financial incentive to do cod farming off the table. So I think cod farming is a fair bit off.
I just wanted to make a real quick plug here for Michael and the program that NOAA is doing. He kind of went over what's happened with the Maine salmon industry and with the state of Washington salmon industry. Those are some of the most strictly environmentally regulated industries in the world as far as net pen aquaculture goes. Right now, NOAA has a Gulf of Mexico aquaculture plan out for public comment. It's on the Federal Register right now. If you just Google it, it'll come right up. They are seeking public input to now having aquaculture in federal waters in the Gulf of Mexico. This would be the first time that aquaculture is allowed at a commercial scale in the U.S., and they're seeking public comment. I know I'll be supporting, we'll be submitting comments in favor of the plan and what areas of the plan we'd like to see addressed that maybe need a little bit of improvement to make it more commercially viable. But rest assured that the U.S. has the most strict environmental regulations on the books, and if you want to see net pens in the federal waters done right, it'll be done right in the U.S. So I'd encourage you to go out and look at the Federal Registrar and submit comments.
Well, in closing, I think if there's any big messages I hope you all walk away with, it's that the Midwest has an ever-growing aquaculture industry. Their aquaculture in general has seen quite a bit of progress. A lot of the concerns that have been out there for many, many years are being addressed within the industry and through regulation. Also within fisheries themselves, we're seeing a lot of improvement in management. We're seeing a lot of places where stocks are coming back. A number of examples of these great aquaculture companies and also some improving fisheries and regulatory bodies and so on are in that room right there. So I encourage all of you to go around, taste some more fish, talk to folks, and learn a little bit more. And of course, please, in the marketplace, support sustainable seafood by enjoying it and praising those and supporting those who offer it. So with that, thank you to all of the panelists for your time and your expertise.